Hello everyone, today we talk about liquid fire, a formidable instrument of Byzantine warfare that, as you know, becomes almost a meme of medieval military technology, associated in fact with the armies, or better, especially the navies of Constantinople. Really, it was employed also on land, but we will understand why it was so famed, etc. I actually discussed it already in a video that is Byzantine naval tactics of the 6th to the 11th century, that actually deals with what is notoriously assessed historiographically today. There's the actually limited employability of this mixture, that the formula of which was also supposed really to be a secret. There is a lot of mythology surrounding the the uniqueness, like this fact that this was a super weapon that only the Byzantines had it, and it was so decisive and all these kind of adjectives. There were some circumstances, including fighting at sea, especially in the one of Marmara, that would help the Byzantines greatly. However, we know, first of all, too few about how it was actually employed. Secondly, we know that actually other peoples used this from quite a while. The same Greeks, actually, since the Peloponnesian War, are the first, at least confirmed, employers. And we are fairly sure that this most incendiary mixtures were very well known and used throughout basically all these millennia. And then actually, in fact, even the possibility of using this in a profitable way at sea were quite limited. All right, and so the effectiveness of the navies and the armies of Constantinople was not much due to the liquid fire, also known as Greek fire later on by especially the foreigners, because it was famously used, probably in also some of the best ways, by the Byzantines. This great and enormous deal that we made, just because also a bit like the Greeks that we inherited this technological bias from, in fact, tend to make some sort of deterministic and idealistic sense of history, when the reality, especially of warfare, like of the good enough, of what really works in the field or at sea, is really different. This is not to say, by the way, that it wasn't actually an important weapon, and that it would be able to at least like the tip of the iceberg to tip the balance itself of many encounters, but there is also much less specificity and also actual evidence to suggest that it occupied such a relevant space in the broader might of the great might of the Byzantine military, that, in my opinion, should be appreciated for many other reasons, at least that you don't hear too often around, that they're a bit like the same ones you find in any good professional, some ecumenic scale military coming from that civilization, but that in fact are a bit more unspecific, and so are a bit more complex to understand, and so people tend not to stop on them very much. Like just last month, as you know, I made the same exact point regarding the English armies of the 100 Years' War, that I myself exalt very much for the obvious quality that they had, that however wasn't connected specifically to the longbow per se, as many people want at this point, I would say, of historiography, to keep believing in. Is it, again, not that these weapons were not useful, otherwise they would have not used them. That's also always the golden rule. But they occupied like a role that, especially as technologies, we, for some reason, as modern and secular people, tend to overly emphasize and blow out of proportion. This topic, by the way, is pretty big. Like there is, as you understand, also a pretty big scholarly attention to the topic in general. there is really a few you can base yourself on to really describe what was happening with so-called liquid fire, not just in the Byzantine Empire, but in fact in many other times and places that are scarcely documented, and that, generally speaking, again, would have not really thought in terms like, we really win wars because we have liquid fire. All right, so today we mostly introduced liquid fire from the standpoint of early high medieval warfare, Byzantine warfare. And then at some point we will also look at the broader picture in many other videos depending on the context, including the same one as I was just referring to before for the video about Byzantine naval tactics. So the use of incendiary substances in warfare can be traced, as I was saying before, back to at least, but it was obviously older, the 5th century BC, because essentially we first see it employed during the Peloponnesian War, together, by the way, with lots of other tactics that we incidentally are informed about because that, say, specific context of classical Hellenic literature would describe. All right, so that's one of the single best documented, possibly even the best documented, relatively to times and places like to other ones in history, period, in the history of warfare. So that we can find something like, I don't know, the use of screens of smoke, but other things we see eventually, look, the Mongols used that, they were so advanced, but let's say certain things were always more or less around, and the fact that they're more or less documented is also like, these are not major deals, like, I don't know, smoke screens. I doubt I'm even ever going to make a video about this, but how they're still obviously used, but how relevant are they in general terms from a strategical standpoint, right? I make lots of videos about the Peloponnesian War, for example, just recently, also naval warfare, where we observe essentially what really matters at a core level. Right, so then obviously various cultures employed flammable mixtures to gain tactical advantages at some point, especially in siege and naval warfare, for the presence of lots of wooden structures that were easy to burn down, to cause significant structural damage to the enemy, whichever purpose he was pursuing. And it was also pretty much symmetrical, right, reciprocal. The distinctive incendiary weapon known as Greek, or better again, liquid fire, remains in our, say, in the annals of military history, mostly connected with a hallmark of Byzantine military ingenuity. It is, in this context, traditionally attributed to Callinicos, that is a Syrian architect in the service of the Byzantine Empire, who is reputedly believed to have formulated this mixture, this formula of ingredients, around 673. Naturally, this is very notional and anecdotal. As we were saying before, this stuff was already around. Of course, Byzantine Syria at this point had been overrun by the Arabs, and there were many Syrians who had taken refuge in other parts of the empire. Syria was historically, with Antioch, like a great Hellenistic culture center with lots of libraries. Especially Syria had been sort of the most faithful of the Levantine provinces that otherwise sort of had opened the gates to the Arabs, who, on top of this, and we will see it now, had also acquired basically some of the greatest Hellenistic libraries in Turn and the other provinces, far from actually wanting to destroy that. Some of them literally made up the story they would burn everything that wasn't the Quran, but actually were clever enough to hoard these veritable treasures that, regardless of the aforementioned difficulties that we have to document in depth, for example, Arab society in the so-called age of Islamic Golden Age, gives us potent hints and signals that they knew for this, especially in these first centuries after the conquest of the Levant, a lot, but I mean really a lot, about ancient, say, science intended for, say, for what science actually was in antiquity. So mostly like philological notionism to a degree, but of, for example, ancient histories regarding natural phenomena, etc. And we understand, of course, that the broader knowledge that also this Syrian architect may have owned, and that liquid fire is conventionally associated with, would have been shared, again, by lots of other peoples. It wasn't really a mystery for everyone. More of that later, because, again, the formula of this mixture was, at some point, anecdotally, almost proverbially, thought to be secret, and that basically the Byzantines were the only depositaries of such technology, but it's not really the case. There is some truth to that, but it's definitely not in the sense that other peoples did not use incendiary devices, including liquid fire as well. The Byzantines may have objectively topped that, but for reasons, in fact, that didn't quite lay just in the liquid fire, by the way, ingredients of which mostly came from abroad as well. So the Mesopotamian oil fields that naturally like emerged in the Iraqi lands, like were actually not in control of the empire, so actually were in the hands of the caliphs of the Abbasids, that also with Baghdad, as you know, had that enormous scientific, like literary legacy at hand. And so they could have simply not been secret technologies that nobody else knew about. Now, the first documented deployment of liquid fire occurred during the protracted siege of Constantinople by the Arab fleet from 674 to 676. I would like to point out that notoriously, the Islamic fleet at this point was composed largely of actual Byzantine and even properly Christian, in fact, marines, crews, admirals that the Arabs had basically coerced from the ports of Egypt, Palestine, Syria, etc., to that were some, in fact, the most important of the empire before the Islamic conquest, to besiege Constantinople. And this is the moment where the, let's say, liquid fire underscores its devastating efficacy, because, of course, the siege of Constantinople happens by sea. You couldn't really besiege Constantinople otherwise. And the Byzantine fleet is able to inflict devastating losses to the Arab one that apparently suffered dramatically of this liquid fire. The fact that, in close waters with relatively predictable winds, etc., you can use this mixture that also floats over the sea surface to essentially burn the enemy with enormous risk still, because, again, it's not much like a one-to-one thing, but at some point it should have been ignited, like the catapults themselves, or the siphons, as we'll see now, were, because you could also throw incendiary mixtures in the forms of some bombs based. But the range, considering the variability of wind, of currents, etc., is still risky. Like, you can set on fire your own same fleet, etc., and it's not like we have an actual video footage of how the Byzantines triumph over the Arabs in that sense. So the actual means are relatively lost to legend. In any case, it's clear that throughout its history, liquid fire was predominantly utilized in naval engagements and siege warfare, where, as we explained, its unique properties could be leveraged to maximum effect against enemy forces. The precise chemical composition of liquid fire remains a subject of scholarly debate. I mean, as you understand now, we just have an idea, of course, how this mixture could have been created, but we do not have the precise, explicit information from any source telling us what was the actual proportion. So that this remains shrouded in mystery, also due to the alleged, again, secrecy surrounding its production, especially from the Byzantine side. It's widely posited that the original 7th century formula, again, assuming that had been new, which is also quite unlikely, underwent iterative refinements over subsequent centuries, which is also kind of obvious because, of course, armies changed, fleets changed, and so even though not that much, and in fact, like this mixture would have been mostly the same, some changes in the combination of the various elements, or properly different ways in which it was practically employed, because here we're not even talking about ammo, like the size of the siphons or whatever. Like we are, generally speaking, not in possession of those absolute measures, adapted to some new tactical need and available resources as well. Historical texts do exist referring to some of the possible information to reconstruct this all. For example, the Liber Ignum, which is a 12th or 13th century compendium of earlier incendiary recipes, is to be found in the West, that already at that point, of course, had gone over to the East, finding lots of manuscripts. It's sometimes probably not used even by the same Byzantines or by the same Muslims, and that the Westerners mostly needed because, not because they needed to do things technically. There are still people thinking that the Renaissance was triggered by Byzantine refugees with their books, brought to the West. No, like the West was already ahead by this point, to the point of wanting to have these manuscripts that they knew in advance they would find there because they were that well learned and they perfectly knew what they had to research, to just have theoretical information that could help teaching better, like passing down this practical knowledge they had already developed for themselves in autonomy, and in parallel to, again, some basic practical capacities that they would have had from the warfare, the techniques, the exchange, etc., all the time. And in the Liber Ignum, that is literally the Book of Fires, we have a catalog of a variety of mixtures with the principal ingredients possibly used for liquid fire that include naphtha. So this is, as you know, the volatile petroleum distillate, or a type of that, pitch, resin, sulfur, quicklime, bitumen, oil, charcoal, turpentine, and in some accounts saltpeter. Now this is very interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a very complex mixture, so surely there was some great art behind that. And of course we're talking times in history in which technology compared to our own was quite limited, but it was based on a great deal of empirical in fact, experimentation and traditional employment of these compounds that were already with the science, the mathematics of the time were pretty well, let's say, combinable. And that, in this case, as you know, literally contain the same ingredients for actual gunpowder. Right, there were different types of incendiary devices, and I've made, as you know, also recently multiple videos on medieval artillery. Never made a video properly about the sort of prehistory of firearms, of gunpowder, especially, and how the latter, in fact, came to be used for military purpose. You know that there is this notion that the Chinese, for example, use this just for more peaceful purpose. This is absolutely not true. The actual and before Europeans, the actual difference is that the Chinese seem to have made a much more incendiary use of essentially what would also be used by them later on as gunpowder. So initially compared to Europeans, then instead preferred mostly like the explosive effect. Now, the first thing as a military historian I can think about this, because even again they had the ingredients, they toyed with the stuff from even a long time, is that probably had to do with encapsulation, the fact that Europe had much more concentrated fortification, whereas the Chinese, let's say, control larger swathes of populace from a more sort of imperial standpoint. Maybe they needed just to spread fire over like settlements or something. It is a very approximative answer, but it may actually be correct. The point here is that, again, at least what we find in the Liber Ignum is already what would have eventually used for gunpowder. Again, gunpowder was probably like toyed with already from the 13th century for actual military purpose in the West. But of course, they would have known the ingredients before, including their specific characteristics. This mixture, at least these likely principal ingredients, are very fascinating. There is essentially an explosive, even potentially component. There is properly an igniting one. There is one that aims to stick, right, and to basically isolate in part from it, allowing for internal combustion, right? So not exactly what we were saying before, to have this fire burning even on water, right? So regardless of all the chemical, physical explanations we could provide with this combination, we do not know better how the actual combination of liquid fire ingredients, right? We just know that mostly they revolve, first of all, around these elements. The inclusion of saltpeter is the most relevant, again, because of the explosive element, because it is the key component, as you know, in later gunpowder formulations. And in this sense, it is considered at least improbable for the 7th century, because here, as you understood, we're over like basically half of a millennium later. And it's possible that, especially by that early medieval point, that chemical knowledge was limited, significantly limited. I have reserves on this, but again, it's not mostly like whether they knew these components or not, right? But what kind of purpose and what kind of just availability they had, even just to experiment with this stuff, that we also, of course, don't know much about. Right, because also for the ancient world, we know that technology was very advanced and that there were very sort of innovative, like sort of incredible almost inventions, like, I don't know, steam engines, etc. But we, aside from certain notion, mostly deriving from the Alexandrian tradition, etc., we do not know how they actually studied and researched this stuff, how they tested it, etc. They didn't care, by the way, to let us know, right? They had more important things to think about. If you had been in the Byzantine Navy, at that point, you would have not really cared too much about the actual composition of liquid fire, also because you would have been provided that by people who were not even in the military, or maybe they were, but they would have not at large even shared this formula. You would have thought, for example, like how to properly use it, which we're also not properly told in great detail, because there is all a practical reality just as much as, I don't know, we know so much about the Roman military in historical hindsight, but it's not like a centurion ever wrote to us how he would command his own unit. Just to give an example of what we're talking about, there is a lot of submerged unknown that unfortunately we have to routinely cope with in history. Surely enough, each ingredient, in whichever combination proportion, contributed to the weapon's fearsome reputation. We understand that naphtha ensured a liquid, highly flammable base. Quicklime, known for its exothermic reaction with water, as we were saying before, caused spontaneous ignition upon contact with the moisture. Sulfur produced choking, that is, toxic fumes that had already been used, as you know, for example, at the siege of Dura Europos in the 3rd century AD between the Sasanians and the Romans, in tunnels, for example, to asphyxiate properly the diggers. And resins and bitumen enhanced adhesion instead. So these were sticky. And even if they weren't just about the liquid fiber. This is as if you threw this at the enemy and it remained stuck, so he could literally burn better. And also, of course, allowing the fire to cling to surfaces and burn also like structures, etc., especially wood, persistently, right? So a pretty nasty weapon, as you understand, which would have been dreaded in this regard, but that, as you also understand from the general background, would have cost a lot, right? It was not infinite to produce. It had to be employed with very specific skill and expertise. The unique properties of these components gave liquid fire its tactical versatility itself and led to a variety of descriptive names. Mixtures containing quicklime, which ignited when exposed to water, were nearly impossible to extinguish at that point, earning appellations such as wet fire, so connected to probably that water floating, wild one, sea fire, literally in Greek, pure θαλάσσιον. The latter being the term, in fact, preferred by the Byzantines themselves. So not even liquid fire. Greek fire would have been, like, to them, Greek was an insult in the moment. But properly maritime fire, sea fire. And mostly because it was connected with the navy, right? The name Greek fire, as we said before, was a later Latin European designation applied somewhat indiscriminately to a range of Eastern incendiary weapons. It would be very interesting to some degree, we'll see now, to realize how much the same Westerners would have used liquid fire, right? But it was understood, at least historically, that it had been Easterners who had mostly used this stuff. This, in general, could derive from the fact, because there is a huge parenthesis I don't want to open regarding the notion that basically the Westerners would have been sort of civilized or developed whatever by the Easterners who had all these technologies. The picture is actually much more concrete, and it's something similar to what you could see in ancient times, like Hellenistic powers having all these hyper sophisticated technological innovations and then eventually losing to the Westerners that simply take what they had and even improve them because they were already basically at the same level of development. Unfortunately, people have this strange idea that basically there is a stupid people that does not know how to do things, but at some point, for some reason, steals this technology and starts using it, and also magically wins against the other. And nobody explains how that happens, right? Mostly, if technologies develop, and even in the way they are applied, they are surpassing the alleged originals, right, or wherever they had allegedly originated. It's an indicator of the fact that the former context is already technologically advanced as much as the one of alleged origin. So people have literally a very hard time understanding this elementary sort of history of science, of technology, of even economics. We will surely make more videos about this. But again, the notion that the Westerners would have simply not had their own capacity to do the same is ridiculous. Also, especially considering that they had the single most performing level of artillery development in the following centuries compared to those other places. So frankly, the notion that it would have been technologically backwards, aside from if anybody has a general knowledge of Western European philosophy, science, technology of the era, is just ridiculous. It doesn't stand on its legs. Now, formulations of liquid fire potentially incorporate saltpeter, producing the semi-explosive effects as well, which is very interesting. And it's something that, for example, immediately Europeans again start using as far as probably gunpowder, probably about cannons was concerned, but especially using explosive shells, right? When you realize that probably the development of because we see artillery was initially, I just made a video recently explaining this from an etymological and terminological historical standpoint, was not even describing gunpowder. But as soon as properly cannons are created, there are explosive shells there, right? So the notion that more or less how to create this stuff was for explosive purposes was there in the West probably betrays the fact that something similar, regardless of the more technical and properly economical supportability, for example, the spread of artillery, do not have much to do with the knowledge of the actual components, and with the same gunpowder from quite a long time, right? Which also, prospects the possibility that the liquid fire at some point, especially in the later centuries, but we don't know how early on, had also a concussive element, probably in the weapons arsenal, while sulfur-laden mixtures generated noxious gases that could incapacitate or demoralize adversaries in other ways. So just out of the combustion, it would have been also more realistic, but more intoxicating stuff, like just to burn out in that moment would have added to the effect. The defining characteristic of liquid fires, as we understand it historically, however, was its liquid consistency, that, as we explained before, was likely attributable to a high naphtha content. You can argue that the naphtha was the most important ingredient of this all, but it would have not worked alone to confer properly the overall characteristics of liquid fire for its military employment. And that, however, mostly allowed for proper liquid fire to be projected as a flaming stream, right? As a sort of flame. It's the same concept of flamethrower, all right? And this, for which it's also more memed, right? That's basically how it's, as we'll see now with the siphon, etc., was properly shot. This liquidity distinguished liquid fire from the existing solid or semi-solid incendiaries and underpinned its other names, including prepared or artificial fire, median fire, or volatile or molten fire. Again, there were different names because we are in a pre-lenient context. There is no categorical definition, encyclopedically speaking. All these terms are very useful, by the way, because they reflect how overall flexible and sort of ingeniously dynamic these mixtures were, probably in the purpose of their own creation and the way they were applied, experimentally speaking, against also during the same warfare, right? So each term reflects its engineered nature as well as adaptability. The formula for liquid fire was a closely guarded state secret in Constantinople, or at least it seems so, the specific one. And again, it's wholly possible the Byzantines had their own specific formula and combination that, again, could be quite complex and unique, but not in the sense that the effects of, say, this weapon per se, like the mixture itself and its military employment, would have not existed outside of the Byzantine Empire. This is absolutely, as we'll see now, we have the actual explicit evidence of this. But again, the imperials genuinely guarded, treasured their own, entrusting it, according to tradition, solely, think of how sort of mythological this is, to Callinicos' descendants, the Lampros family, right? This exclusivity underscores the strategic importance the Byzantines placed on maintaining a monopoly over the weapon, deriving from, again, the specific mixtures that, again, from a Syrian background, it was generally speaking a land of some, not just of important culture, Hellenistically speaking, but also of sort of strategic relevance, of some militarized past, quite relevant. So where that specific technology may have been employed more consistently. By the way, this is just anecdotal, but I made a video about the Haddad Syrian infantry that, in part, as we've seen, used like during the later Crusading era, explosive pods. It was completely normal at the time. But I mean, Syria, that's important because Syria maintained an important degree of urbanization and kind of some of the strongest militias, urban militias in the Islamic world. So with some important tactical, logistical capacity, etc., was appreciated also by the Seljuks, by other rulers that came to employ them. Nevertheless, again, it's also unrealistic that a weapon like this would simply be a secret, like guarded by a single family that you had to rely on as an empire just to know the secrets of the mixer. So surely, again, there is surely a bottom of truth as far as these people were pretty skilled and expert. They had some obligations not to reveal the exact formulas. They had to work for the imperial arsenals, absolutely. But there would have been other people handling this, not just within the Byzantine military, but also abroad, right? Surely the Arabs had their own version of the Lamprey's family, maybe the same, again, for Damascus. In fact, and this is the point, evidence suggests that similar incendiary technologies proliferated well beyond Byzantine borders. By 835, Arab forces were deploying a liquid incendiary in naval combat in the Tyrrhenian Sea, right? So in Italy, we're pretty much sure that, towns like Amalfi and the Arabs is like they would have known, right? Especially if you consider what kind of naval engineering developed in a few centuries just from those same centuries, also what kind of naval power at large came with it, beating back the same Arabs. You realize that even in the West, this stuff was very well known. By 844, the Emir of Cordoba, right, so we are in Spain, had equipped his newly constructed fleet with mangonels and naphtha-based weapons, right? So again, there is no doubt about it. Consider that these areas of Southern Europe are also the most technologically advanced at the time, especially as far as these more sophisticated technologies are concerned. I mean, the Franks, the Upper Rhine Valley were probably the centers of European metallurgical production, swords, etc. Like also, this is also, though technically speaking, war horses, etc. for heavy cavalry, but this more sort of siege naval technicality was more developed in, generally speaking, the Islamic dominated and or influenced world. And still, for example, the Italian peninsula at large would have maintained its own pretty high levels of such technology, probably from the Christian side. One historical account claims that the Caliph, the founder of the Umayyad Caliph, Muawiyah himself, 660-680, outfitted his ships with fire-emitting devices, possibly siphons, as we will describe this device later, suggesting, in fact, early Islamic experimentation with such weaponry. We're talking basically the same time of Callinicus. We're talking 30 years away from Heraclius, and so they're completely different. Like we will see, we'll talk about sort of early Byzantine warfare as well, and see how, of course, these incendiary devices were already around, and again, likely they had never run out. It's possibly that throughout all the Roman era, there was something similar to this, but was also not really necessary for use overall, just were not told it was there, right? But just to show you how close to a certain late antique, say Hellenistic, and importantly scientifically and philosophically developed world that this really was, which the Arabs were sort of became to be the depositories of in large part after the conquest of the Byzantine Levant. Another source posits that a variant of Greek fire was in use by Muslim forces as early as roughly the beginning of the 7th century. We don't know when precisely, because at least Muslim is at the earliest the 30s, but at that point they had really yet to even become a power provided with specific siege, but even naval skills were of notice. In fact, such an early date remains contentious among historians due to the lack of corroborating evidence. Like, this is an incredibly underdocumented reality at some point, some of the darkest periods. I mean, not even Islam is, theologically speaking, that convincingly documented as far as most of its foundational phases. So it's sort of even more like to show you, like in perspective scale, like how big the issue can be and how these notions can be just mythological in nature. Now, the most iconic and well-documented method of deploying liquid fire is, however, notoriously, you see it often also many covers of Byzantine history books, in the illustration from the famous VII-XIII manuscript, dated to around the 1200. In this depiction, this is, by the way, probably Sicily, right? So we don't know whether there were local Sicilian artists or people that were very, they might have been Byzantine themselves, but there's almost like some more humanistic Italian grace to the illumination. Beautiful anyway, and very Byzantine indeed. And in this depiction, that of course I used also in the video myself, the incendiary was projected from twin tubes or siphons, I don't know how you say it in English, mounted at the prow of Byzantine warships, likely powered by sophisticated hydraulic pumps. Just think about the cost for the time. That, however, ensured a forceful and sustained stream. This again fits mostly that Byzantine and in turn Hellenistic logic of let's have the super weapon that all the civilized world will be envious of, but with results that could be mixed in the broader, cost-benefit ratio. Again, not to say that this weapon was useless, absolutely not. It surely fulfilled its function, let's say, in the broader picture. It's not like the Byzantines in 1200 were faring too well, especially 4 years later. So this gives you, again, an idea of how relative technology is. In many other times in warfare, like where more technologically advanced peoples were, even assuming that the Byzantines at this point were more technologically advanced than the West, which is highly debatable, to say the least, would be defeated in any case. Now, the engineering of the aforementioned siphons was a testament, surely, to Byzantine technological prowess in its own regard. It combined metallurgy, hydraulics, and pyrotechnics, because you had really to create something that not just was resistant to this pretty, strong forces and the combustion and etc., but also making it flow in ways that would be, in fact, functional to minimize damage and risk, etc., for a military purpose. So something that was not just shooting something at a distance, but something that you could handle in effective ways against the enemy. Now, there is a very interesting Scandinavian source, probably a Norse saga, the one of Ingvar VII-XIII, describing the use of bellows to propel the fire, suggesting a simpler, possibly supplementary mechanism. So this saga is written down, as you know, ex post, right, in times where later may have also, again, I will not enter the philological issue of the saga, but essentially it describes at least like probably the content of it, because it emerged probably like at least in the Latin version. We don't even know the author, whether Odder Snorrason, or we don't know, but in the years preceding 1200, so we are more or less in those years. The events, however, describe the last Viking campaign in the Caspian Sea in 1041. This is incredible, because these are the kind of, if you think the Manzikert was just 30 years later and that were Norman mercenaries in Armenia, like it gives you an idea of how basically like the Viking era, the Norman one are. They're two very different things in reality, but they sort of flowed into one another to some extent. So it's a very interesting source. And as you know, the Norse served in consistent numbers in the Byzantine military to know something, so technologically interesting, like a liquid fire and its weapon properly could could be. I made multiple videos about the Varangians, so if you want to check that out, I made also a video about the Battle of the Iraqian, that is roughly 40 years later, compared to that. That gives you a sort of concrete idea what kind of stage in the art of war we are and what kind of national interactions existed between these cultures and their also material dimensions. An Arab source from roughly 1013 details siphons operating by a piston mechanism, analogous essentially to a syringe, right? You press and the thing spurts from the other side through the piston pressure. This was very sort of obviously logical because it allowed for precise control, at least over the flow of the incendiary, right? The Byzantine term for siphon is actually klisteros, in fact, which, as you know, has very, name reflection for another medical injection device. And in fact, this could and would also denote a syringe, basically highlighting at the same time, as we were saying before, with the pre-Linnean terminologies, the linguistic and functional overlap between these devices, right? They could be even called with different names, but they may have been actually the same thing. So constructed from or clad in, by the way, copper, bronze, or iron, which help naturally maintaining the stability, the pressure, probably the damage that we imagine, like also operating this weapon could or would create. The siphons were both durable and resistant to the intense heat of the burning liquid at the mouth of it. Emperor Leo the Wise Tactica, so this military manual that we intensely discussed in the video about Byzantine naval tactics, it revealed that these siphons were mounted on an elevated false deck, strategically positioned above the prow level of an attacking vessel, ensuring essentially a downward trajectory that maximized the weapon's destructive reach, right? So they were basically elevating the siphon so that he could naturally reach more easily through the parabolic shot the enemy, and so also reducing the chances that you could shoot over yourself or too close to yourself. He also increased the range just like that, given that the enemy vessels at that point would have had, in fact, a lower deck. This is an important strategy because it also shows what was the point of it. It wasn't just like simply sticking to the hull outside. It was about properly burning the deck, like impeding the enemy marines to operate on it. And you know that most naval warfare at the time was basically boarding, right? And so even though these long-range weapons existed at different levels, if you inundated an enemy deck with liquid fire ignited, it was like a pretty big problem. Also, probably was just a matter of targeting the enemy personnel, and also all the rigs, which could also more easily spread fire further, with great risk also for the same Byzantines, because again, we're talking fairly short distances that now we will sort of try to also guess. The siphons were swivel mounted as well, enabling omnidirectional, more or less almost omnidirectional firing to counter threats from multiple angles. This was not necessarily safer, so that it's doubt and say we don't know exactly how they would have come out. Like there would have been many types. It's possible that it was just like more or less a specific angle of fire. In any case, Emperor Alexius I seemingly further enhanced the psychological impact of liquid fire by adorning his ship's prows with gilded lion heads, from whose gaping mouths the fiery stream erupted, a dramatic display designed to intimidate adversaries. Whether this is real or not, whether Alexius had any specific influence of this, or he decided that such, gold, by the way, should have been invested just for such representation is unknown. However, the fact that liquid fire would be represented in those terms by the sources suggests that it was definitely a fearsome weapon, that there was some broader meaning attached to that evidently made it important in the Byzantine military, and that in general accorded itself with also the more varied than believed level of psychological and especially through visual effect that enemy armies, fleets, and their details, their decorations, their flags that would actually have. Again, we often can't verify the exact information, but we still understand that liquid fire was at that point in particular history, the 11th century, a hallmark of Byzantine warfare, and that the empire was rightfully proud of it. Historical records consistently note, as we observed at the beginning, that liquid fire was, however, most effective in very specific situations like calm seas, where especially the absence of strong winds or waves allowed for more accurate targeting and prevented premature dispersal of the flaming liquid. Importantly enough, this also tended to operate the same liquid fire from a safer standpoint, where, this parts of it would not sort of fly backward in or being, pushed against your own ship at certain points. Again, this is all the more interesting considering also what naval tactics really were at the time, which weren't actually that different from land ones. If you consider the line of ships as a battle line, in fact, that they would eventually interlock with the enemy ones, and most of the struggle basically revolved around that. So if we consider this in a more practical sense, at least when you realize how that sense, how do you employ Greek fire in a situation like this? Because in order to come close to the enemy, in order to shoot this Greek fire also in large amount quantities that are not like covering entire stretches of sea, because that would have really been a major logistical challenge that would have been incoherent, incongruent probably with the delicacy to balance odds of the major naval engagement. You would at least risk to set on fire part of your own ship. So we don't really understand how this all worked. In part also because there were other incendiary devices at play, and so that there was a generalized risk where you would also sort of maybe self-sabotage to, at some point, if you were hooked at an enemy ship or something, like to spread fire also on the enemy line. So again, it's difficult to know how the stuff concretely happened. It's true that if liquid fire is just limited, it just sticks to the enemy ship, it remains there, in theory, you should be relatively safe regarding the possibility of the fire itself spreading too easily over to another ship. But that could have been true in that sense for basically, like it would have made basically this liquid fire mostly like at that point, a 1 versus 1 rather than some broader strategical weapon that could, set on fire, again, entire stretches of sea, would say the enemy was to pass for some reason. So we don't have to imagine anything, especially in the bigger engagement, anything dramatic about this. It was an important weapon. It was importantly destructive, probably to the degree of literally knocking out an enemy ship more easily than others and giving an edge, but always considering how much it cost, right? This is just like artillery, even of the pre-gunpowder type. They cost a freaking lot, right? The siphon, the fuel, it was also dangerous to carry it, by the way, but in general, it was very expensive. So you couldn't say have an edge because, say, all the Byzantine ships in the line would simply be able to knock out the enemy or to set the respective decks on fire. Just like that, and the battle was won. All right. So how these things happen, it's not really clear. Probably it was more like a 1 versus 1 thing, and also something you had to be very cautious at handling per se. Otherwise, yes, you could create some havoc among the enemy, like maybe creating fractures in the enemy line, prompting even just the enemy to leave, like to abandon position in some way, so creating more confusion, say bringing the enemy to just again depart, like losing cohesion or something. That works if it is combined with a broader military force operating with this. It's not just liquid fire making it. Besides, back to the point of the origin, the use of siphons as devices, aside from liquid fire, in fact, predates St. Callinicos' invention. There is a source, in fact, from around the 60s of the 6th century, mentioning fire propelled by the aforementioned clusteroi, so the siphons, basically. And the chronicler Theophanes notes that siphon-equipped ships were in use before the advent of liquid fire. Theophanes the Confessor is mid-8th, early 9th century. So these reveals also within the Byzantine historiographical tradition an awareness, of course, not just of the history of liquid fire, but also of its technicalities and how, of course, the elements that made liquid fire sort of more relevant at this point were already there before they came back together. Like, one reason why this early and somehow high medieval, there would be late medieval Byzantine liquid fire, by the way, but the reason why this seemed to have developed, majorly developed, and sort of spread in the Byzantine military during the early Middle Ages, but even more specifically, like the post-Islamic invasion, I think it's self-evident, right? At that point, the empire loses half of its territorial extent to the Muslims, but especially the latter basically break the Mediterranean political unity, and they attack the St. Constantinople from the sea, right? So the Byzantines developed a great deal of naval capacity that has to rely on the usual ingenuity of this Greco-Byzantine civilization that was really confiding in, let's say, ideas, especially like in the early part of this resolutions of this invention, like or mostly innovations, application of the same, was really genius-like, right? The Byzantines had, especially at that point, a very deeply ingrained. The peak probably was reached by the time of the Pseudo-Maurice, etc., at the end of the 6th century, beginning of the 7th. But in fact, we are almost there in that sort of Roman practicality and Hellenic intellectuality, right? In the best combination. The sort of Greek technologism and sort of intellectual genius prevails in that sort of ever greater nationalization of the Byzantine Empire, the shrinking of the universal character. Hence, you have a very competent military, a very qualitative one that manages to save the empire, by the way, from an avalanche of peoples that arise in them by investing in specific, like, technological innovation, which also stems from periods of crisis, right? When Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean, they did so because obviously they had always at hand properly upkept navy, etc. But at that point, it was useless to even just innovate on the fundamentals of that. There would have been some change over time, but if you don't have challenges, you're just not even brought to find new solutions. So there is a major reason why liquid fire was developed. It was mostly like the Islamic threat at sea that the Byzantines had to also, generally speaking, successfully cope with. Actually, in the video about Byzantine naval tactics, we observed how, because this is also the message that some time passes, the Byzantines were the masters of naval warfare, especially thanks to liquid fire. And telling the truth, like, they were a very, again, competent military, one of the few that had properly like a statile fleet at that, especially in that early era. But, I mean, they got victories as much as they got defeats. Like, there doesn't seem to have been any particular, like, dramatic edge overall. If there was mostly inherent Byzantine civilization and how it fared compared to some Islamic powers. But in this sense, it's something also for pre-industrial cultural difference, something relatively leveled, right? Now, the aforementioned information regarding the presence of this siphons and liquid fire, even before, of course, the 7th century, suggests not just earlier incendiary mixtures, such as the sulfur, naphtha, and bitumen blend, for example, by the Sassanids during the siege of Petra in Sinai in 551, that we are aware of, or a similar concoction developed by the Athenian Proclus under Emperor Anastasius I, 491-518. You know, by the way, Justinian would end the Athenian school of philosophy later on, but there was also some important scientific research and innovation for the Eastern Roman Empire at that point, coming from there. And all this may have this kind of liquid fire at the time by both the Persians and the Romans may have been delivered via siphons. And this may fit, by the way, the aforementioned period of crisis of innovation, because again, we will see how also in the early Byzantine period, there was, compared even just to the previous centuries, an important degree at least of technological experimentation, and sometimes it derives also from, again, this tradition of Byzantine manualistics that makes us know things in more sort of schematic and explicit ways. But of course, the practicality of warfare was probably even more homogeneous in material culture, etc., across different peoples, especially these more developed militaries like Rome, the Persians, the Arabs, at least the later Arabs. So these precursors laid the groundwork for the more advanced liquid fire. At least we understand that as far as we can witness some kind of greater importance of liquid fire later, this already existed, and we can think that everything was already ready for further development. Combining proved chemistry with refined delivery systems, also tested in siege warfare at sea, etc. Besides, beyond siphons, Byzantine and other peoples employed alternative methods to deploy incendiaries. We know it well. Petraries, mangonels, these were the main siege engines, and other of this group were used to hurl earth and ware pots filled with incendiary mixtures. It was sort of the most typical way to go, sealed and fitted with fuses to ignite upon impact. Very simple concept. Again, this stuff existed from a very long time in the history of the art of war. Some pots contain already burning contents, creating, for example, immediate conflagrations upon shattering. Consider again that there is all a debate regarding this kind of weapons, how explosive they actually were, because as we've seen, the actual ingredients for that effect existed from quite a while. A 13th century source indicates that these containers were fashioned from diverse materials, including glass, paper, even metal, leather, and earthenware, each chosen for its availability and suitability for specific tactical scenarios. We will see this in other videos. I talked partly about this in the Mamluk Midfa gun video for example, that deals, however, with sort of Mamluk gunpowder technology as it was really developing, especially in the early phase of their history. We know that Arab forces frequently employed hand-thrown small pots, as evidenced during the siege of Salonika in 904. By the way, this is in Europe, as you understand. So it's not even just like the aforementioned technological sharing had any geographical boundary, and likely this was a pan-Mediterranean thing, at least, right? Maybe other populations in Northern Europe, etc., had sort of at least less frequency in the use of such means, and or they were more direct as far as certain tactics were concerned. But we could have started seeing these things somewhere else as well. Like artillery wasn't quite a thing historically in the migration era in Northern Europe, etc. But as you know, with the context between Constantinople and the Vikings, etc., like you have a pretty interesting sharing. And again, technology did not really sink during the early Middle Ages as we think. Like we have, like now it's useless to draw comparisons also because this thing of liquid fire was considered to be typically like a Byzantine thing that was seen also by those other populations as a grandiose thing. But as you understand before, like we heard this being used in Italy, in Spain, so it would have not been that strange at all, at least in the Mediterranean. In 904, by the way, such weapons were used by the Arabs to devastating effect against fortifications and personnel as well. The Byzantines would have basically been at the same level. Later, Western manuscripts occasionally depict small jars launched via staff slings. There were all kinds of projectional capacities, and a method that extended the range, of course, of these incendiaries in a simple and effective way. Crucially, these pot-based incendiaries, while effective, were distinct, however, from the liquid Greek fire used by the Byzantine navy, which relied, as we've seen, on siphons for its unique projection capabilities. Otherwise, they would have simply bombarded the enemy decks with other means. It's obvious that the siphon itself would have not had such an enormous range compared to catapults or even just, hand-thrown pots. But it had the advantage of at least unloading all this liquid on the enemy decks in a pretty consistent and concentrated way. That was the main advantage in this form of delivery. Otherwise, you could have just had, you could bombard the enemy in different ways. And as we explained, also the way this liquid fire was distributed quantitatively in a battle is probably not immense, and so would have been maybe used for flank attacks to again press the enemy from the rear, from the flanks, even properly igniting certain traits of sea, etc. So this is mostly the range that we have to think of. Emperor Leo, reigning from 886 to 912, documented the development of the so-called hand tubes for dispensing Greek fire. This was a portable innovation operating from behind iron shields to protect the user from retaliatory attacks. There is an illustration from an 11th century manuscript appearing to depict such a hand siphon. This is also very famous. I inserted it here as well. And this essentially appears as a compact device. It's just like an arm flamethrower that allowed essentially for close quarters incendiary warfare at some level. So you could carry it on siege towers. You could essentially just move into breaches with that. Narrow passages could be, for example, controlled. Additionally, a portable small caliber siphon was recorded in use during the siege of VII in 928, demonstrating the adaptability of liquid fire to various combat contexts. This was a battle that the Byzantines fought against the Kurds that ruled the fortress. We'll talk about this in some video for sure. By the way, this arm flamethrower may correspond to the Strapton, a term used by both Leo the Wise and Constantine Porphyrogenitus. I made a video on about as well in his sort of encyclopedical work about Constantinople for his son, by the way, that describe a flexible device, so likely a pump and hose apparatus of some sort that offered mobility and precision in confined or dynamic battlefields, because essentially the fuel would be ignited at the moment it came out of the pump, and you could use the hose and to get more of this in it, so and to have it really more flexibly handled wherever you want it, without something more rigid like the siphon, especially the bigger ones mounted on warships that were really, really big. So as I was saying at the beginning, there is a fairly sort of normal picture that we paint here that, as you understand, is not basically the one of a veritable super weapon. It would have been really peculiar to see, especially siphons mounted on ships, etc., but likely other powers had something similar. It's possible, again, the Byzantines had, for different political, strategical, cultural reasons, a great deal sort of technological legacy of scientific tradition, etc., that would allow them to enhance these weapons to a greater level than other peoples. Again, emperors were said probably to tell their sons that the barbarians at large, among the various things that they searched for in Byzantine Empire, various treasures, was also the formula of Greek fire. But in that sense, like, what was, to sum up the tactical and strategic significance of liquid fire in the art of war? So in this broader context, liquid fire represented a pretty useful weapon in medieval tactics, especially naval and siege warfare. Its ability to project a continuous stream of unquenchable fire gave the Byzantines an important edge in defending, especially Constantinople, given the geographical surroundings and the straits control, like the Marmara Sea, etc. So this very peculiar environment where you could more or less knowing, how water and wind would have behaved, and things were more controllable in general. So maintaining control over key maritime routes as well. Again, we'll not descend in the strategy of how the Byzantines managed to sometimes, basically like in any other navy at the time, intercept enemies at different sort of choke points, especially in the Aegean, etc. There was all a way that was practiced very empirical fashion. And I partly described this in Byzantine naval tactics. Consider that fleets themselves were mostly like land army support, like armies mostly proceeding along like the coastline, being supplied by the navies that at some point had to counter one another to prevent these strategic forces to reach more critical objectives. The psychological impact, in particular of liquid fire, cannot be overstated. That also seems very important. Like in warfare, the most important thing is not much the physical, material damage, but the psychological one, right? What is really perceived. The sight of ships or fortifications, by the way, engulfed in relentless flames, coupled with the toxic fumes and the inability of extinguishing the blaze in particular, often broke the morale of even the most resolute enemies. Consider that this could happen also with fire pots. We sort of didn't talk about it too much, but think about especially the sticky side of this mixture that could be also different, as we've seen from probably what we call liquid fire, but not being being taken off once it fell on you. This is true for different liquids. Think about boiling oils, something like that. The burns were dramatic. Tactically, the use of siphons allowed Byzantine commanders to engage enemy vessels, as we've seen, at a relative distance, neutralizing, perhaps in some circumstances, especially in relatively bolder ones, the numerical superiority of opposing fleets. Or you could have a single ship equipped with the siphons that, especially in smaller engagements, could take out different ships because of that. But in larger battles, things were more complicated. And when we look at those defeated Arab forces during the sieges of Constantinople, we are told anecdotally that they were taken out thanks to liquid fire, but sometimes they're just as limited statements as this, to the point that we practically know nothing else about the actual extent of this damage from the specific technology and how especially this was employed in the battle. This rival mounted siphons and elevated firing platforms were all one at sea, like enabling rapid response to threats from multiple directions, making Byzantine warships formidable adversaries in close quarters naval combat. Obviously, as we already said, probably just a minority of Byzantine ships were really equipped with liquid fire, especially the siphons and sort of these larger quantitatives that could be poured on the enemy decks. For the rest, incendiary devices were present at many different levels, and so you can't, in fact, distributed probably at that point, like if you had some extra stuff to be distributed among the ships, you could basically use it more profitably through pods, right? This kind of also explosive projectiles, as far as we can hypothesize. Then using it from the siphon would have not been enough, but it would have cost very much. The structure itself would have been that expensive. If we look at the broader mythology surrounding liquid fire, we can say that this was a closely guarded asset. Its production and deployment overseen by a select cadre of specialists to prevent its secrets from falling into enemy hands. This would have been true also for the Umayyads, both of Syria and of Spain, the Abbasids of Iraq, the Fatimids of Egypt. We do know again that this stuff was used. We should open a parenthesis, for example, for the later Italian navies that dominated the Mediterranean and were more advanced. They basically supplanted in the same Byzantine fleet, because again it's understood that probably regardless of the meme that the same Byzantines made of liquid fire, it was a much more widespread technology than we realize. It's difficult here to make comparisons because of the sheer scarcity of information. Nevertheless, like why, for example, like I don't know, we don't hear much of this for the Italians that had, again, the most advanced navy out there. There is either you think that we've seen also in the time of Alexius Comnenus, apparently, so the moment in which basically also the Venetians were around already in strong force and so on, the Byzantines were starting to rely on them. This would be the emperor would decorate with lions probably the mouths of the siphons. So why would structurally the Byzantine navy need or be characterized by these weapons and not other navies specifically? This may be just even a cultural issue that eventually reflected in documentation, so that it's not necessarily connected with the comparative scale of military development of different cultures. This secrecy concerning liquid fire did not prevent, as we've seen, the spread of similar technologies, as evidenced by the early Islamic adoption or simple availability from Byzantine times, or even maybe even the Sasanian ones, of liquid incendiaries. Again, mostly the naphtha used by all these powers, including Constantinople, came from the crude oil wells in Mesopotamia. The Byzantines did not control these territories for most of this time, so they must have got it from there anyway, even from probably enemy states that could have somehow blocked the exports. Naturally, the stuff could be smuggled, it could be other sources, by the way, but probably also the quantitatives were not enormous, right? And we don't know enough about how all this stuff was treated, put together. Again, the formula is a bit of a mystery. We understand it was very complex. The Byzantines' reliance on liquid fire in naval warfare underscored their strategic prioritization of maritime dominance, at least being the upper force throughout most of this period in the Eastern Mediterranean, in fact, particularly the Aegean, where the control of trade routes and coastal strongholds was paramount. The use of gilded lion heads, as we were saying before, and other theatrical embellishments further amplified the weapon's role as a tool of psychological warfare, projecting Byzantine power and invincibility. In siege warfare, the deployment of hand siphons and pot-based incendiaries allowed for targeted strikes against fortifications, siege engines, and troop concentrations. The portable strapton and hand tubes facilitated some individual commando tactics of sort. This is important, especially in fortifications. It's our imagined close-quarter combat warfare tactics of some sort. That could, for example, knock out, like if you set, a man-at-arm on fire, like you've achieved much. Naturally, again, it was unpractical to go around with this thing, and we don't even know how it technically worked, because from at least the iconography of this all, like, it would have been also a limited weapon to use. But the main function was always, like, directed at probably consuming, deteriorating, destroying enemy structures, especially the wooden ones. Imagine siege warfare, especially even more in naval one, how concrete this would have been. If anything, there were different ways to set this on fire. In fact, not just the liquid fire, but the sticky dimension, right, provided by certain elements in the formula would work well for that. This may have enabled, especially in certain static contexts, perhaps, the small units to disrupt larger enemy formations. We can imagine, even siege towers maybe being provided with siphons of some sort to clear the enemy ramparts before unloading troops on them at Similia. This may sound all a bit too adventurous, but we likely are looking at very closely combined tactics where troops would have received specific training for or would have simply been able to exploit the spaces, the timing. We know this happened at so many different levels of combat. The versatility of liquid fire capable of being also projected via siphons, like hurling pods or dispensed through portable devices, made it a multifaceted weapon that could be adapted to different battlefield conditions. We'd probably be surprised how much, right, from mostly the open naval engagements to protracted urban sieges, but we may even think about something in open field, depending on the specifics. The art of war in the Byzantine era was thus very aware of the potentiality of liquid fire, which exemplified also the empire's fusion of technological innovation, tactical ingenuity, and strategic foresight. Its development and use reflect a sophisticated understanding of chemistry, engineering, and psychology positioning, the Byzantine civilization is pioneering in the evolution of incendiary warfare, especially throughout the early Middle Ages, part of the High Middle Ages as well. And so as long as the empire lasted, they had some sort of, again, specialization in this kind of stuff. While the exact formula of liquid fire may never be fully reconstructed, the legacy of this arm endures as a testament to the destructive and awe-inspiring power of medieval military technology, of which the Byzantines for a long time were the pinnacle in Western Eurasia. It would be interesting again to see how much cultural perceptions, the same ones the Byzantines portrayed, let's say, about themselves, have to do with this. How much likely this stuff was present in, for example, even the West, even though there may have been different reasons why it was not so prominently depicted or thought of, etc. And as I was saying in the beginning, yes, this is amazing and everything, but we cannot go as far as saying that, say, liquid fire was just simply the game changer, right, in most circumstances, right? There wasn't properly like the precondition for it. And at large, we are looking essentially at a weapon that we can't properly document, that we know too few about, and that tendentially we probably will never really know in its entirety. We know, however, that it was not, of course, like a fake or something like it. It's not a myth. It was there, and it definitely was seen as an emblem of imperial power, right? This notion that let's say the great goods of the empire. So the specific notion contained in the De Administrando Imperio by Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus. Again, we made a video about him. We're in the 10th century. This was essentially a broader encyclopedical work we used. This is also ethnographic. It's typically Byzantine, and one of the best, in fact, of 10th century Byzantine civilization that was, in many ways, a very good place, in a very good place at the time. Great time in Byzantine history, to his son Romanus, stating that basically the other peoples in the world covet these three things, like a princess born in the purple, so a Porphyrogenita Byzantine princess, Greek fire, just liquid fire, and a mechanical singing bird, which in a sense tells you perhaps better than anything, excuse me, drink a little, than anything else, what, let's say, level of, even of relatively poetical and ideal meaning was concealed behind this Greek fire, right? The princess born in purple is mostly due to, again, everybody wanted to be the Roman emperor. Everybody wanted to marry into the imperial house, to have that blood, to have that power, that connection. The mechanical singing bird is just more like an aspect. This is where diplomatic. This was a diplomatic advice, because the notion is that barbarians were enchanted by these kind of prodigies, right? Mechanical clockworks were sent also by the Caliph of Baghdad to Charlemagne in the previous century, right? The Franks sent back horses and swords, as we were saying before, as always. And so liquid fire between these two things is not, you see, it's not even just a definitive, it's literally just like, it's not even the single most important thing. It's not just this set of things. It's just something it's a prodigy, but it's something that the same Byzantines would have considered as who knows which practical solution to their own problems, or particular addition to their military in a more concrete sense, right? So technology is important in warfare. It is also in times like the Middle Ages, but it should be interesting to observe how much, sort of paradoxically, we as moderns overstated its relevance, right? That I would think is the most important takeaway. Whenever, naturally, we say appreciate the history of technology, we should realize the specifics of the same, so that this video was mostly considered as an introduction to the concept like of liquid fire. I think never really made a video about this. I mean, about similar things and topics in the history of artillery. And we often, again, also in Byzantine, talking about Byzantine naval warfare, etc., we obviously mention it. However, always bear in mind that whenever we find, like we did today, like all the various references to this specific topic, we are looking at exactly at that. That is a collection that we otherwise say that it's as if like we presented all in one shot all the kind of info that simply we could gather about that that information, flattened, meaning these are centuries of military history that witnessed so many clashes, so much divide, issues, etc., that are basically just fleshed out in this single references that typically make you just think about the same and not about the context that would be needed to understand this topic. So one could find even older references to this stuff, and surely we will look at especially liquid fire at some point even more in detail. But it's important to know well the entirety of Byzantine warfare, like from the even the apparently more trivial things also to the bigger dynamics, also socially, politically, etc. Because without that, like every single missing piece can and will actually prospectively distort the picture that is needed to profitably reconstruct like the actual context and the actual ways, in this case like liquid fire, would be used, right? So it can't be just to be given for granted. This is what mostly like becoming experienced in military history, in the art of war, really is. It's not just knowing the single info that you should naturally reason quite carefully about and collect and being hungry for it, because that's also how, as a beginner, you find the references, you start collecting the sources, say where you can find also other information, etc. But at the end of the day, it's more like the analysis. It's properly how you criticize the whole picture that is going to make the greater difference, even just as an analysis, again, that is, again, what eventually we extrapolate this overall, say, judgment from. I think this is really the most important picture, and definitely the one that provides us with the best insight, without which we couldn't really do much. Very well, we really made lots of videos about Byzantine warfare. It's always interesting to notice how relevant like this stuff really is in when is, especially as I was just saying, put together, right? You wonder sometimes, talk about the Byzantine Siloi of between the 7th or the 11th century, you would say, what do I care about? Like, light infantrymen. About it. That all actually makes it all together. You couldn't have the Byzantine army of the time without a Siloi, right? So Greek fire is a bit more iconic, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily more important, all right? And that's also what you should habituate yourself to reason like, really, as far as that that limit of ours can be. We have only, oddly enough, here I see only 50. Would be the 52nd video about Byzantine warfare. I thought really we had made more, but now I realize that no, 52 videos just about Byzantine warfare is not a few, right? But considering the wall, we also have lots of Byzantine history, proper just. We have lots of videos about the Byzantines in general, and that is also incredibly important altogether. Nevertheless, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.